Last December, we launched a podcast called Into the Killing. In each episode, we discussed a cold case that was eventually solved. With our last two episodes, we created full videos for them that are available on YouTube. So if you were listening to the podcast and were missing the visuals of a usual criminally listed video, you should check out the new videos. Of course, we'll continue to make the podcast available to download on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you find great podcasts. Just before we start today's video, we're going to take a few moments to talk about our wonderful sponsor, Magellan TV. When the weather gets to be unbearable, I love sitting inside and watching a great documentary. Magellan TV has the best collection of documentaries to choose from. An excellent one I watched last week is called Mafia in Italy, A Bloody Pact. The documentary is utterly fascinating. In 1992, two anti-mafia magistrates were murdered in Sicily. For a long time, it was thought that the mafia was behind the murders. But the documentary shows that the murders were much more complex and people in the Italian government may have been involved. Mafia in Italy, A Bloody Pact is an absolute must-watch. I also really enjoyed the history documentary After Braveheart. 1995's Braveheart, starring and directed by Mel Gibson, is a fantastic movie. But the events depicted in the epic film were only the start of the Scots' fight for independence. After Braveheart looks at the war after the death of William Wallace. After Braveheart is available in 4K and it's absolutely stunning to watch. We are so thankful that Magellan TV has been a long-time sponsor. Right now is the best time to sign up because Magellan TV has an amazing exclusive offer for criminally listed viewers. You can get 30% off an annual membership. That means you get access to over 3,000 documentaries for just $3.50 a month. Just go to try.magellantv.com/criminallylisted to claim your discounted annual membership today. If you've been watching with me and you let your subscription lapse, that's no problem. You can still claim this offer. So check out Magellan TV today because you'll find something great to watch and you'll be supporting Criminally Listed. Number 3. Jack Henry Abbott. Jack Henry Abbott was born on a U.S. Army base in Michigan in January 1944. Growing up, Abbott had severe behavioral problems. He was transferred around to different foster homes. He dropped out of school in the 6th grade. He spent the next several years in and out of reform schools. When he was 18, he was convicted of cashing stolen checks in Utah, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was sent to the Utah State Prison in Draper, Utah. On January 10, 1966, 21-year-old Jack Abbott was in a prison fight. He was armed with a knife, and he stabbed a fellow inmate, James Christensen, multiple times and nearly severed his right arm. He stabbed another inmate in the neck. Christensen died 10 days after the attack. The other inmate survived the assault. Abbott claimed that the attack happened because Christensen wanted to make him his wife. But when he was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon, the official reason for the attack was listed as revenge because Christensen told the guards that Abbott had contraband in his cell. Jack Abbott was sentenced to an additional 15 years in prison. On March 13, 1971, 27-year-old Jack Abbott escaped from prison with another inmate. 4 days later, he and 2 other men robbed a bank in Denver, Colorado. Abbott was arrested in late April after 6 weeks on the lam. For the escape of robbery, he was sentenced to 19 years in a federal prison. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary Marion in Marion, Illinois. While in prison, Abbott began reading and he found a love for it. He also started corresponding with writers. The first author he exchanged letters with was Jerzy Kosinski. Kosinski had written 3 best-selling books, The Painted Bird, Steps, and Being There. Abbott then read an article that one of the best American writers of the 20th century, Norman Mailer, was writing a book about Gary Gilmore. Gilmore had started getting in trouble in his teen years, and he was in and out of prison for most of his adult life. Over 2 days in 1976, Gilmore murdered 2 men in Utah. After Gilmore was convicted of the murders, he was sentenced to death. He waived all rights to appeals, and he demanded that he be executed. Gilmore was executed via firing squad on January 17, 1977. He was 36 years old. When Abbott wrote to Mailer, Mailer was one of the most famous authors in America. Along with authors like Truman Capote, Hunter S. Thompson, and Tom Wolfe, Mailer is considered one of the pioneers of new journalism, which is essentially long-form nonfiction that incorporates techniques of fiction writing. Mailer's debut novel, The Naked and the Dead, was a bestseller and is considered one of the best World War II books. His 1968 book, The Armies of the Night, won the Pulitzer Prize. In 1973, Mailer wrote a biography about Marilyn Monroe, where he claimed that she was killed by CIA and FBI agents. The book was highly controversial, but it was also a bestseller. Mailer was also highly controversial for his views on gay rights and the women's liberation movement. Mailer was also known for his volatile temper. In November 1960, Mailer and his wife, Adele Morales, hosted a party to announce that he was running for mayor of New York. Mailer and Morales got into an argument, and Mailer stabbed her twice with a penknife. Morales was nearly killed. She spent several days in intensive care and ultimately survived. Morales refused to press charges because she did not want the incident to impact the lives of their 2 children. Mailer and Morales divorced in 1962. Because of events in Mailer's own life, he may have felt a connection with Jack Abbott. There were also several connections between Abbott and Gary Gilmore. Not only did the 2 men have lifelong problems with the law, but they were in the same prison twice at the same time. They both served time in the Utah State Prison and the United States Penitentiary, Marion. But Abbott and Gilmore didn't know each other. One thing that may have drawn Mailer to Abbott is that Mailer did a lot of research into Gary Gilmore's life, but he never met him. Mailer started writing his book after Gilmore was executed, so Abbott could have been a live stand-in for Gilmore. Mailer's book about Gary Gilmore, entitled The Executioner's Song, was published in 1979. The book is over 1,000 pages long, but it was still a huge success. In 1980, Mailer won the Pulitzer Prize for the book. Many people say it's Mailer's magnum opus. In 1981, Jack Abbott got the chance to apply for parole. Norman Mailer wrote letters to support him. He even said he would provide Abbott with a job if he were to be paroled. Abbott was ultimately granted parole. On June 1st, 1981, the letters Abbott wrote to Mailer were published in a book entitled The Belly of the Beast. 4 days after the book was published, Jack Abbott was paroled after serving 18 years in prison. He then traveled to New York City. He became a minor celebrity after he was released. He appeared on Good Morning America, and Rolling Stone interviewed him. He attended parties featuring the elite of New York's literary circles. Early on the morning of July 18, 1981, 22-year-old Richard Adon was managing an all-night cafe that his father-in-law owned. Adon was an aspiring playwright. 37-year-old Jack Abbott was at the cafe with 2 women. He went to use the washroom, and Adon told him that was for staff only. The 2 men started to argue. Then Adon led Abbott to an alley where he could relieve himself. Abbott did so, and then they started arguing again. Abbott was angry because he thought that Adon made him look stupid in front of the women. Adon turned and started walking away. Abbott grabbed him from behind and plunged a knife into his heart. Adon's heart was nearly cut in two. Abbott went back into the restaurant and told the women that he killed someone and he needed to get away. He then ran out of the cafe. The women left the cafe, but they didn't venture far. The police were called and they found the dead body of 22-year-old Richard Adon in the alley. People who were in the cafe pointed out the women who were with Abbott, and they told the police his identity. The police went to arrest Abbott, but he was gone. The day after the murder, the New York Times, who was unaware Abbott was wanted for murder, published a positive review of his book. After the murder, Norman Mailer was heavily criticized for supporting Abbott and helping him get paroled. People said that Mailer might be a talented writer, but as someone who nearly stabbed his wife to death, he was probably not the best judge of character. Jack Abbott remained on the lam for nearly 2 months. Then the U.S. Marshals received tips that Abbott was working in some oil fields in Louisiana. They tracked him to Morgan City, Louisiana, and he was arrested on September 23, 1981. Jack Abbott went to trial in January 1982. He claimed that he was innocent and he only acted in self-defense. The jury deliberated for 15 hours. They acquitted Abbott of second-degree murder, but found him guilty of first-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. In 1987, Jack Abbott published a book called My Return. It was panned by the critics and the public. In the book, Abbott blamed all his problems and his actions on society and the prison system. He showed no remorse for killing 22-year-old Richard Adon. In 2001, Abbott applied for parole, but he was denied. His parole was denied because he didn't show any remorse for anything he had ever done. On February 10, 2002, 58-year-old Jack Henry Abbott was found dead in his jail cell. He had hanged himself with a noose made from a bedsheet and shoelaces. After the Abbott controversy, Norman Mailer continued to publish books, and several were bestsellers, including Tough Guys Don't Dance, The Gospel According to the Sun, and The Castle in the Forest. Mailer even had a guest spot on the 5th season of Gilmore Girls. Norman Mailer died in November 2007 at the age of 84. Number 2. Gregory Green. On July 14, 1991, the police in Detroit, Michigan were called to the home of the Green family. The caller was 25-year-old Gregory Green. When the police arrived, he led them into the home that he shared with his wife, Tanya Green, and his 2 stepchildren. Tanya was 6 months pregnant. Gregory led the police to the dead body of Tanya. He admitted that he had stabbed her to death. Gregory was initially going to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead, in 1992, he pleaded no contest as second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 15 to 25 years in prison. Gregory applied for parole in 2004 after serving 12 years. His request was denied. He applied for parole again later that year, and he was denied once more. He applied for parole twice in 2006, and both times he was denied. Each time he was denied because he showed a lack of empathy and remorse for what he had done. But then, in 2008, after serving about 16 years, he was paroled. Sometime after Gregory was released, he met a woman named Faith and they started dating. Faith had 2 children from a previous relationship, Chadney Allen and Kara Allen. In October 2010, Faith gave birth to a daughter, Gregory Green. A couple months later, in December 2010, Gregory and Faith were married. Then, in September 2012, Faith gave birth to her 4th child, Kaylee. The family lived in Dearborn Heights, Michigan. It's unclear if Faith knew about Gregory's homicidal background. Not long after the birth of Kaylee, the relationship between Faith and Gregory became rocky. In February 2013, Faith applied for a personal protection order against Gregory. She said that Gregory was saying that things would get ugly if she didn't move out. He also started kicking objects, including a couch that Kaylee was sleeping on. After his erratic behavior, Faith wanted to go to the police station to file a formal complaint, but she was afraid she'd be locked out of the house if she left it for too long. Faith's request for a personal protection order was ultimately denied because the judge did not think that there was enough evidence to grant one. In October 2013, Faith filed for divorce, but they didn't end up getting divorced. They reconciled, however, the relationship wasn't meant to be. Faith filed for divorce the second time in August 2016. On September 21, 2016, at 1:15 a.m., Gregory Green called 911 and asked the police to come to his family's home. The call was eerily similar to the call Gregory made to 911 25 years earlier when he killed his first wife. When the police got to the family's home, Gregory was outside waiting for them. He led the officers into the basement where Faith was tied up on a couch. Her face had been slashed from ear to chin with a box cutter, and she had been shot in the foot. But she was still alive. Her children, 19-year-old Chadney and 16-year-old Kara, were dead on the floor in front of her. Gregory explained he had made Chadney bound his sister, and then he tied up Chadney. Once they were both bound, he shot them both 3 times while their mother watched. Gregory then took the police outside where a Nissan Maxima was parked. In the car were the dead bodies of 5-year-old Coy and Kaylee, who had just celebrated her 4th birthday weeks earlier. Carbon monoxide was being pumped into the car. Faith was taken to the hospital, and she survived the assault that resulted in all her children being murdered. In March 2017, Gregory Green pleaded guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count of torture, and 1 count of assault with intent to do great bodily harm, less than murder. Faith did not want him to have a chance at parole. But because of the way the plea deal was structured, Gregory was sentenced to 50 years in prison, and he'll be able to apply for parole after 47 years. But the judge doubts that Gregory will live long enough to seek parole. He'll first be able to apply for parole when he's 97 years old. At Gregory's sentencing hearing, Faith said, "Your justice will come when you burn in hell for eternity." 54-year-old Gregory Green is currently serving his sentence at the Michigan Reformatory in Iona, Michigan. The earliest he could be released is September 2063. Number 1. David Edward Maust. David Edward Maust was born on April 5, 1954, in Connellsville, Pennsylvania. He was the second of 4 children born to Eva and George Maust. George grew up in a series of foster homes where he was sexually and physically abused. Eva had several mental problems. A social worker said that she was narcissistic, psychotic, and marginally functional. After the birth of Eva's second son, Jeffrey, she had a mental breakdown and she had to spend a month in a psychiatric hospital. David had severe behavioral problems. One day, when his brother was in his crib, David set the bedsheets on fire. When David was 7, his parents got divorced. After that, David's behavior became worse. When he was 8, his mother sent him to live with his father. The next day, George sent David back to his mother's home. When David was 9, he tried to drown his brother in a lagoon. His brother also remembered him beating a squirrel to death with a baseball bat. David's problems were too much for his mother to deal with, so she sent him to a psychiatric hospital when he was 9 years old. While living there, David anxiously awaited her visits, but she rarely came. David was released from the hospital when he was 13, and he was supposed to go live with his mother and stepfather. But Eva didn't want him in her home. So David was sent to live in a group home in Chicago, Illinois. In 1969, when David was 13, he choked a boy, but didn't kill him. 2 years later, David was watching TV with another boy, and he strangled him with a rope. Once again, the boy wasn't killed. In 1970, David was sent back to the psychiatric hospital. He escaped and he went to his mother's home. When he returned home, his mother chased him with a knife and told him to get out. Eva ended up arranging for David to live with his uncle in Georgia. In 1971, when David was 17, his mother enlisted him in the army. David was stationed in Frankfurt, Germany. David kept a diary, and he wrote about waking up one morning in April 1974, and he was naked. A 13-year-old boy named James McClister was on top of him, and he was naked as well. David had befriended James sometimes before waking up with him. On May 26, 1974, David drove James into some woods on the base on his moped. He then tied James to a tree and then beat him with his fists and then a 5-foot-long board. After the 13-year-old boy was dead, David buried him under some leaves. James's body was found a month later. David was interviewed because he was one of the last people seen with the boy. David explained that he was screwing around and he threw a screwdriver at the tire of James's moped. The screwdriver became stuck in the spokes and James crashed. David said that the crash killed James. David said that he didn't want to get in trouble, so he hid the body. David Maust was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. David liked being in prison, and he did not want to leave. Many people thought he was crazy for this belief, but he knew in prison he couldn't hurt anyone. David Maust was released in May 1977, and he was sent to Chicago. In August 1981, 27-year-old David Maust was reflecting on his life. He thought that being gay was the source of all his problems. So he wanted to find a former sexual partner and kill him. On August 9th, 1981, he went over to the man's house. When he got there, he learned that the man was in jail. As David was leaving, he noticed 15-year-old Donald Jones walking by. David convinced Donald to get into his car. He drove him out to a quarry in Elgin, Illinois. He stabbed the 15-year-old boy in the stomach and then drowned him in a pond. After killing the teenage boy, David fled to Galveston, Texas. Donald Jones's body was found floating in the pond a few weeks after he was murdered on August 26th. In Galveston, David couldn't stay out of trouble. In December 1981, he stabbed a 14-year-old boy, but the boy survived. In 1982, David pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The police investigated Donald Jones's murder, and they found out that he was last seen in the neighborhood where David had gone to find his former lover. They learned that David had served time for manslaughter. They also found out that David worked just a few hundred feet from where the body was found. Also, they were suspicious of him because he split town just after the murder. In May 1982, a detective interviewed David in jail in Galveston. David admitted to killing Donald Jones. In 1983, David was extradited to Illinois to face charges for the murder of Donald Jones. In the extradition papers, the officer wrote that David Maust is very dangerous and a Gacy type, referring to the infamous serial killer John Wayne Gacy. In Illinois, it was determined that David was unfit to stand trial, so he was committed to a psychiatric hospital. That year, David gave the district attorney an 87-page diary where he talked about the two murders he had committed. David wrote that for murdering Donald Jones, he should be sentenced to death. David Maust spent over 11 years in several different psychiatric hospitals, and then he was deemed fit to stand trial. In May 1994, David Maust pleaded guilty to the murder of Donald Jones. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison with 11 years credit for the time he spent in the psychiatric hospitals. The district attorney was acutely aware that David Maust was dangerous. He did not think that David should spend one day less than his 35-year sentence. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. At the time, Illinois had a system where inmates could cut their sentences in half for good behavior. Every day that they behaved in prison, one day was taken off their sentence. Because of that program, David only had to serve 17 and a half years in prison, and he had already served 11 years. If he behaved himself, he would be released in June 1999. David Maust actually agreed with the district attorney, and he did not think he should be released early. In 1999, David wrote a 5-page letter to the Illinois Department of Corrections and asked to be labeled a sexually violent prisoner. If he had been labeled a sexually violent prisoner, he could have stayed in prison indefinitely. But his letter was ignored, and he was paroled in June 1994. After David was paroled, he was homeless because he couldn't find a room in a halfway house. He eventually found housing in Oak Park, Illinois. In January 2001, he lured a 15-year-old man to his apartment. He attacked the man and struck him 7 times on the back of the head with a pipe. The man escaped and reported the incident to the police. But the man didn't press charges. In 2003, David moved to Hammond, Indiana, and got a job at a trophy shop. He lived in a house that had been converted into apartments. In December 2003, the police in Hammond were investigating the disappearances of 2 young men, 13-year-old Michael Dennis and 16-year-old James Regani. The pair were friends, and they were both last seen on September 10, 2003. The investigators were trying to figure out who the boys hung out with. They learned that they both went to the apartment of a 49-year-old man named David Maust. When the police saw David's criminal record, they immediately had the suspect. The investigators asked David's landlord if they could bring in cadaver dogs to search the house. The landlord agreed. On December 9, 2003, the police searched the house. Wrapped in plastic, encased in cement in the basement floor were the bodies of 13-year-old Michael Dennis and 16-year-old James Regani. They most likely had been suffocated or strangled to death. The police kept searching the basement. The next day, they uncovered another body that was encased in the cement floor. He was identified as 19-year-old Nicholas James. Nicholas went missing in May 2003, 4 months before the other two boys went missing. He had worked with David at the trophy shop. Nicholas James had died from blunt force trauma to the head. After the bodies were found, many people said that they were shocked that David was allowed out on the streets. This included David's own family. David's brother, Jeffrey, believes that David should have been sentenced to life in prison for the first murder he committed nearly 30 years earlier in 1974. David Maust was arrested and he was charged with the 3 murders. In February 2004, the district attorney announced that they would be seeking the death penalty. Several family members of the victims supported the decision. Another supporter was the mother of David's first victim, James McClister. Perhaps the most surprising supporters of David being executed were David's mother, Eva, and his brother, Jeffrey. But in the end, David wasn't sentenced to death. Instead, he pleaded guilty to the 3 murders. He was given 3 consecutive life sentences without the chance of parole. So David Maust was going to die in prison. However, probably no one expected him to die so quickly. On January 20th, 2006, 51-year-old David Maust hanged himself with a bedsheet in his cell. He died the next day. He left a 7-page suicide note in which he takes responsibility for the 5 murders. He wrote, "Life in prison is not what the parents wanted, and the Indiana taxpayers do not want to pay the bill. The families wanted me to receive the death sentence, and so do many families and parents across America. Dying is not my first choice, but it is the right thing to do. For when I look in the eyes of the mothers, I can feel the pain of their sorrow." The police and David's family believe he may have committed other murders. Specifically, David's brother, Jeffrey, remembers hearing discussions that David killed 3 boys when he was younger, and they are buried between Chicago and Georgia. However, no other murders have been connected to David Maust in the years since his death. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Don't forget to download the latest episode of our podcast, Into the Killing. In this episode, we discuss the murders of 2 women in Colorado. Their murders wouldn't be solved for years, and sadly, there were dire consequences because of these delays. You can find Into the Killing on Deezer, Stitcher, Amazon Podcasts, and anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.